Big Shaq's grandson ran out crying, straight into the arms of a dangerous garbage man, and within minutes flashing lights turned the whole street into a war zone. What looked like a simple misunderstanding became a mirror to a neighborhood's buried truth. The lockdown didn't just expose secrets, it exposed who they really protect, and who they never see coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the moms below. Cul-de-sac. Every house had a gleaming SUV parked outside. Every hedge was trimmed with military precision, and every neighbor waved in that polite, tightly controlled suburban way. But inside the largest house on the block, Shaquille O'Neal's sprawling estate, something felt wrong. Shaq stood by the tall bay windows, holding a steaming mug of black coffee in his enormous hands, staring out at the street. It should have been a perfect morning. The kind of morning when the biggest worry was whether the pool guy would show up on time. But his gut told him something was off. He couldn't put his finger on it. He turned away from the window and walked into the open-plan kitchen, where Landon sat at the table, pushing his cereal around with a spoon. Landon was just 8 years old, a quiet, thoughtful kid, with dark curls and big brown eyes that seemed too old for his face. Shaq loved that boy like nothing else in this world. But today, Landon wasn't his usual giggly self. "You good, little man?" Shaq asked softly, ruffling Landon's hair as he passed. Landon didn't look up. He mumbled almost inaudibly, "That man keeps staring at me." Shaq paused, his heart thumping a little harder. "What man, buddy?" "The garbage man," Landon whispered, eyes still on his cereal. "He looks at me funny." Shaq walked over to the window again, peering out carefully. Reggie, the garbage collector, was hauling bags into the truck. A big guy, muscular, maybe late 40s with a rugged face and a visible scar down one cheek. Shaq had seen him a dozen times, always polite, always quiet. He smiled faintly to himself. Kids in their imaginations. Still, something tightened in his chest. "Hey, Shaq said, returning to the table, sometimes people just look serious when they're working. Doesn't mean they're mad or scary. Maybe he's just tired. Landon didn't respond, just kept swirling his spoon. Shaq crouched beside him, eye level now. "You're safe here, Landon. Always. Okay? Nobody's gonna hurt you." Landon gave a tiny nod, but Shaq wasn't convinced. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Shawnee, his ex-wife, had taken a call upstairs. Lucille, Shaq's mother, was due over soon. Shaq tried to shake off the unease and headed to his home office, distractedly scrolling through his phone. Endorsements, sponsorships, charity events. Life was good. But even as he read emails, his mind drifted back to Landon's anxious little voice. Minutes passed. A strange stillness settled over the house. Shaq got up again, heading back to the kitchen. But when he arrived, the chair was empty. "Landon," he called, moving quickly now, his heart pounding harder. "Landon." He checked the backyard, the pool area, the side hallway. Nothing. The front door was closed, but when he unlocked it and stepped outside, a knot twisted deep in his chest. Down the block by the garbage truck, Landon was standing, talking to Reggie. For a split second, Shaq froze. The big man was crouched, his scarred face soft, listening carefully as Landon gestured animatedly, a tiny hand waving in the air. It didn't look threatening. It looked tender, but from the corner of Shaq's eye, he saw curtains twitching in the neighboring window. Mrs. Holloway from next door appeared on her porch, hand clutched to her chest, eyes wide. "Shaquille," she called sharply. "Your grandson, is he okay?" "That man, should I call someone?" Before Shaq could answer, the distant wail of sirens reached his ears. He whipped his head around. 2 police cruisers came roaring up the street, tires screeching, doors flying open. Officers rushed out, hands on belts, voices shouting. Shaq ran forward, waving his arms. Wait, he's fine, he's just talking." But they were already moving, fast and aggressive. Reggie raised his hands instinctively, standing protectively in front of Landon. "Sir, step away from the child," an officer barked. Shaq's heart slammed against his ribs. "That's my grandson. That man didn't do anything." The neighbors watched from their porches, eyes darting between the celebrity and the garbage man, the child and the cops. The officers grabbed Reggie roughly, pushing him against the side of the truck. Landon let out a terrified cry. Shaq was there in an instant, scooping the boy up, his booming voice strained but steady. "Landon, you're okay. It's okay, I got you." But as the boy buried his face in Shaq's shoulder, the towering athlete felt something cold slide down his spine. Because despite his fame, despite his fortune, despite the fact that everyone on this block knew who he was, when the police had arrived, they hadn't looked at Shaq and seen a beloved figure. They hadn't looked at Reggie and seen a working man. They'd seen two black men near a white child. Shaq held Landon tighter, his broad shoulders tensed, as he watched the officers question Reggie. The man's eyes flicked up, meeting Shaq's briefly, and in that glance, there was no anger, just quiet resignation. Shaq swallowed hard. This wasn't a crack in his perfect morning. This was a crack in his perfect world. Inside the house later, Shaq sat heavily on the couch, elbows on his knees, head bowed, Landon curled beside him, worn out and silent. Shawnee stood nearby, arms crossed, face pale. Lucille arrived soon after, her wise, lined face tightening when she heard what happened. She sat beside Shaq, laying a hand on his massive shoulder. "I told you, son," she murmured softly. "No matter how big you get, no matter how many people cheer your name, this world don't let you forget." Shaq closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. Outside, the sun still shone, the lawn still gleamed, and the neighbors still watched from behind their curtains. But inside the O'Neill house, the air was heavy with something rawer, something older, something that whispered truths Shaq had tried so hard to shield Landon from. But the morning had shattered that illusion, and somewhere deep inside, Big Shaq knew this was just the beginning. The O'Neill house sat heavy with a strange tension, sunlight streaming through the wide living room windows, while the air inside felt weighted and tight. Shaq, phone pressed to his ear, stood near the fireplace, his deep voice softened by the conversation. Lucille's warm but firm tone came through the line, her words laced with both love and warning. She spoke about how people had looked at her back in the day, how their smiles often hid suspicion, and how even after all these years, some folks never stopped seeing skin first. Shaq leaned his massive frame against the mantel, nodding silently, his eyes flicking toward the kitchen where Landon sat doodling. His grandson's small face was furrowed, hands moving quickly over paper, a little too quiet for comfort. Shaq half listened to Lucille, half watched Landon, torn between two worries. He told himself he'd check on the boy after the call, maybe take him out for ice cream. Anything to lift the heaviness hanging in the house. But time slipped, minutes ticked by unnoticed. By the time Shaq hung up and turned toward the kitchen, the chair was empty, the back door slightly ajar. The sudden silence shot through Shaq's chest like a jolt. "Landon?" he called, his voice filling the house, echoing off the high ceilings. But the boy didn't answer. Shaq strode through the rooms, checked the den, the backyard, the poolside, no sign of the child. He felt his throat tighten, his mind racing to calm itself. He's probably just outside, he's probably just watching the workers. No need to panic. Still, Shaq's long strides quickened as he moved toward the side gate, heart thumping harder. Outside, the soft hum of the garbage truck filled the air, engines purring as Reggie worked his route. The big man moved with practiced ease, hefting bags, slinging bins, his face set in concentration. His scarred cheek caught the light, a harsh line against his dark skin. Shaq's eyes darted left and right, and there, just at the edge of the driveway, was Landon, standing small and alone, gazing up at Reggie. For a split second, Shaq froze. The scene was surreal, his delicate grandson standing before the towering garbage collector, the boy's hands clenched into little fists, his mouth moving as if explaining something only the two of them could understand. Reggie paused mid-motion, kneeling down carefully, his large hands resting on his knees. His face, usually stoic, softened in that moment, his features easing into something gentle, almost tender. He listened closely, head tilted, as if the child's words carried the weight of a confession. Shaq's instinct was to rush over, to pull Landon back, to scold him for wandering off. But something held him in place. There was no fear in Landon's posture, no shrinking or backing away. Instead, there was an odd sense of safety between the boy and the man, like two souls that had quietly recognized each other in a world too busy to notice. But across the street, Mrs. Holloway stood stiff on her porch, eyes narrowed, mouth pressed thin. Shaq saw her lift her phone to her ear, her gaze locked on Reggie. On another porch, the Delaney's leaned out of their doorway, whispering behind cupped hands, their glances sharp and disapproving. Attention, unseen moments ago, now curled through the air like an electric wire, sparking against the bright morning. Shaq stepped forward slowly, his stomach clenching as he watched Reggie reach into his pocket, only to pull out a crumpled napkin and gently wipe something from Landon's cheek. The boy laughed softly, a sound too faint to reach Shaq's ears, but enough to draw a smile from Reggie, a brief, flickering warmth that made his scar fade for a heartbeat. Suddenly the garbage truck's engine coughed and sputtered, the noise slicing through the fragile moment. Reggie stood, towering once again, and gave Landon a nod. He turned to resume his work, but that was when Shaq saw Mrs. Holloway step off her porch, waving one hand sharply, her phone still pressed to her ear. Shaq's pulse quickened. Something ugly was gathering. He crossed the lawn, calling out, "Landon, buddy, come here." His voice stayed calm, but every muscle in his body was tight. Landon turned, his face lit up with innocent excitement. "Grandpa, I was just showing him my drawing." Shaq reached the boy, placing a huge hand gently on his shoulder. He gave Reggie a nod, a silent thank you, a small acknowledgement of the moment they'd just shared. But Reggie's eyes had shifted, his expression now shadowed by something wary. He sensed it too. The shifting air, the invisible noose tightening around the scene. Sirens blared in the distance, faint at first but growing louder, sharper, angrier. Shaq's chest constricted. He crouched by Landon, whispering softly, "Let's head inside, okay?" Landon frowned, confused, but obediently took Shaq's hand. Together they turned, just as two police cruisers rolled to a hard stop at the curb, their doors flying open, officers spilling out in a flash of uniforms and command. Shaq's head spun. Who had called them? Why this fast? Why this loud? "Step away from the child," an officer barked, eyes locked not on Shaq, not on the child, but squarely on Reggie. Shaq turned sharply, his voice steady but urgent. "Officers, everything's fine here. That's my grandson. He wasn't in danger." But the cops advanced on Reggie, who raised his hands calmly, a practiced motion, too familiar, too resigned. Shaq's stomach turned as one officer moved to frisk Reggie. The man's head bowed slightly, his eyes dull with an old, tired pain. "Sir, we got a call about suspicious activity involving a minor," the officer said crisply, glancing briefly at Shaq, but not really seeing him. Shaq's breath caught. "I'm telling you, I'm the child's grandfather. This man didn't do anything. My grandson approached him. He was just working." One officer hesitated, frowning slightly as recognition flickered across his face. Shaq O'Neal. The basketball legend. The icon. But the momentum of the scene, the adrenaline, the suspicion, the assumptions, was already in motion. Reggie stood quietly, his body stiff but compliant, his gaze sliding toward Shaq for the briefest of seconds. And in that tiny moment, Shaq saw it. The shared understanding between two black men in a world that judged before it listened. Shaq scooped Landon into his arms, whispering gently into the boy's ear, feeling the child's small body tremble. He turned back to the officers, voice firm but measured. "I'm asking you, let this man go. You're making a mistake." The senior officer hesitated, tension rippling in the air, before finally muttering, "We'll need to check the report, sir. Please stay nearby." Shaq's jaw tightened. He walked slowly back toward the house, clutching Landon close, his mind a storm of anger, fear, and something deeper, a cold, creeping awareness that even his fame, his success, his carefully built life, couldn't shield them from the world's reflex to suspect, to accuse, to fear. Behind him, the neighbors continued to watch, eyes sharp, whispers sharp, as Reggie, the man who had knelt kindly to a lonely boy, stood handcuffed beside a garbage truck under a flawless, indifferent sun. Shaq stood frozen at the window, his pulse hammering in his ears. The first shrill wail of sirens shattered the peaceful hum of the street, ripping through the neighborhood's quiet like a blade. His heart sank, and instinct took over as he sprinted for the door, yanking it open, just as the first squad car screeched to a halt at the curb. Tires bit the asphalt, and before Shaq could even call out, a second cruiser rolled in fast behind the first, lights flashing violently. Neighbors had already gathered like moths to a flame, clutching coffee mugs on their porches, phones in hand, faces tight with concern. Or was it excitement? Holloway stood stiffly at the edge of her lawn, one hand over her chest, the other holding her phone as if she were ready to narrate the whole scene live. Mr. Delaney, always sharp-suited even on weekends, had his arms crossed tightly, mouth pressed thin. Shaq's massive frame burst out onto the lawn, his booming voice cutting through the chaos. He's just a kid. He's just a kid. He's safe. Across the yard, Landon sat cross-legged on the curb beside Reggie, the garbage collector. The boy's tiny body leaned comfortably against the big man, head tilted up as if listening to some quiet story Reggie was telling. Reggie's scarred face was calm, his dark eyes gentle, one huge hand resting lightly on his knee. But the cops didn't see the tenderness. They saw something else entirely. "Step away from the child," one officer barked, hand on his holster, eyes narrowed and sharp. Shaq rushed forward, arms raised. "That's my grandson. He's not in danger. This man didn't do anything." But the officers weren't looking at Shaq. Not really. They were already moving in, closing the space between themselves and Reggie, with swift, efficient steps. Reggie raised his hands slowly, his jaw tightening, body tense but compliant. "Easy," he murmured softly, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Sir, stand up, turn around, hands where we can see them," barked another officer. Shaq felt his blood chill. He moved faster, cutting across the lawn, his booming voice rising. "Hold up! Hold up! I said he didn't do anything." He was Big Shaq after all. Wasn't his face familiar enough to make them pause? Wasn't his voice enough to command attention? But in that charged moment, Shaq wasn't Big Shaq, NBA legend, millionaire icon. He was just another black man shouting on a front lawn, trying to de-escalate a situation already out of control. The nearest officer threw an arm up, barring Shaq's path. "Sir, stay back. We'll handle this." Shaq's fists clenched, his jaw working, as he fought down the surge of frustration. He lowered himself beside Landon, gathering the boy protectively into his arms. Landon clung to him, wide-eyed, the bright innocence on his face, now shadowed with confusion and fear. "It's okay, little man," Shaq whispered, pressing a kiss to Landon's curls. "I'm here. I got you." But even as he spoke, he watched powerless as two officers grabbed Reggie, spinning him roughly toward the squad car. Shaq rose quickly, voice tight but firm. "Officers, please. That man didn't touch my grandson. He was just sitting with him. I need you to listen." One cop gave him a sharp glance. "Sir, we got a report of a child being lured. We're just following up." Shaq stepped closer, lowering his voice deliberately. "I'm telling you, that man works this street every week. That's my grandson. There's no problem here." But the momentum had already taken over. Reggie was being patted down roughly, his pockets emptied onto the squad car hood. Keys, wallet, a folded bus pass. His shoulders were squared, his jaw clenched, the quiet fury of a man who knew this dance all too well. Shaq's gaze swept the watching crowd. Neighbors whispered behind hands, eyes flicking from Reggie to Shaq, to the police. Their faces carried a mix of pity and vindication, as if they were telling themselves a story they already believed. Shaq's chest tightened painfully. He was Big Shaq. He was supposed to have transcended this. He was supposed to have made it. But in this moment, all his accolades, his trophies, his multi-million-dollar empire, none of it mattered. Not here. Not on this block. Not under these sirens. He forced himself to stay calm, even as his mind raced. He couldn't let this spiral. "Officer," Shaq said, his deep voice steady but edged with urgency. "Can we talk for a second? Please. Look at me." The younger of the two cops finally paused, eyes flicking up, recognition dawning faintly. "Wait, you're Shaquille O'Neal, aren't you?" Shaq gave a sharp nod. "That's right. And I'm telling you, you're making a mistake. This man didn't do anything. My grandson approached him. This is not what you think." The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner, who was halfway through cuffing Reggie. There was a flicker of uncertainty, a brief pause in the relentless machine of suspicion. Reggie, eyes lowered, gave Shaq the faintest shake of his head. A silent warning, a weary message. "Don't get yourself tangled up in this." But Shaq's fists clenched at his sides, his massive chest heaving as he fought back the urge to roar. He wanted to pull Reggie free, to tear down the false assumptions swirling in the air, to confront every ugly glance and muttered word that had led to this moment. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly, drawing in a deep breath, feeling the weight of Landon's small body pressed against his. This wasn't just about today. This was about everything that had come before. Every wound, every scar, every unspoken truth about what it meant to move through the world in skin like his. The officers stepped back slightly, murmuring into their radios, tension still humming but softening at the edges. Reggie remained still, his broad shoulders stoic, his face unreadable. Shaq turned, carrying Landon slowly back toward the house, feeling 100 invisible eyes tracking their every step. Landon clung tightly, his voice small against Shaq's ear. "Grandpa, why were they so mad at Mr. Reggie? He didn't do anything bad." Shaq swallowed hard, his throat thick, his heart heavy. He wanted to shield his grandson from the truth, to preserve his innocence a little longer. But the truth was already leaking in, threading its way into Landon's young mind. Inside the house, Shaq lowered Landon gently onto the couch, brushing a hand over the boy's curls. His hands trembled faintly, not with fear but with the simmering, controlled anger of a man who had seen this story play out too many times. He glanced back through the window, watching as the police conferred quietly by the squad car, as Reggie stood patiently, waiting to be released or taken in. Shaq didn't know which. He sank heavily into a chair, elbows on his knees, head bowed. Big Shaq, millionaire, champion, giant on the court, legend in the world, and still just another black man under the flashing lights. The house sat in a tense, unnatural quiet, shadows creeping along the polished wooden floors as the afternoon sun dipped lower. Inside, Shaq paced back and forth, his massive frame moving restlessly through the rooms, every creak of the floorboards under his weight sounding louder than usual. Landon lay curled up on the living room couch, finally asleep, a small blanket draped over his tiny form. His face was peaceful, but Shaq knew too well that peace could be a thin layer stretched over hidden fears. Shaq rubbed a hand over his bald head, exhaling slowly. He stood by the window, looking out across the front yard. Clusters of neighbors still lingered, gathered in little knots on their lawns, sipping coffee or clutching phones, their heads close together as they murmured to each other. Their eyes flicked up occasionally toward the O'Neill house, then quickly back to each other, their expressions a careful mix of concern, suspicion, and something colder. Shaq clenched his fists at his sides. He could almost hear their words even without stepping outside. He'd grown up hearing versions of them all his life. Such a shame, bringing those kinds of people into a nice neighborhood. Well, fame doesn't change everything. I always wondered how long it would take before something happened on that property. Shaq's jaw worked as he strained to keep himself still. He wanted to throw the door open, to march right up to them and demand they explain themselves. But he knew how that would look. He knew the story that would spin from it, how easily it would be twisted. Big Shaq losing his temper, Big Shaq causing a scene, Big Shaq bringing the wrong energy to their safe block. Instead, he stood there, fists tight, heart pounding, his chest filled with a slow-burning, smothering anger. His phone buzzed on the side table. It was a text from his agent, media asking if you'll make a statement. Let's tread carefully here. Shaq let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Of course, tread carefully. Always carefully. Always measured. Always making sure not to upset the balance. Not to break the fragile peace these people clung to with their whispers and their wine glasses and their polite smiles. He glanced back at Landon, the boy's face soft in sleep, his small hand tucked under his cheek. A rush of protectiveness surged through Shaq, followed quickly by a gnawing worry. Landon had seen everything. He had watched as the police surrounded Reggie, watched as his grandfather's voice, the voice that commanded arenas and lit up TV screens, had been ignored, dismissed, brushed aside like noise. And now, even here, even inside their beautiful home, on a street lined with manicured hedges and luxury cars, Shaq knew Landon could feel the shift. The thin, sharp crack in the air, the whispers that made their way through walls. Shaq moved to the back patio, stepping out into the fading light. He needed air, needed space to think. As he crossed the stone tiles, he caught the sound of voices drifting from the fence line. Two women, Mrs. Holloway and Miss Delaney, stood just on the other side, their words low but not quite low enough. "I always worried when they bought that house. Certain types bring certain problems." "Mm-hmm. And that garbage man, honestly, why let your kid near someone like that? Can't they afford proper security?" Shaq froze, his breath caught in his chest. His hands curled tightly into fists at his sides. Every muscle in his body taut. He knew those words weren't meant to be heard. Or perhaps they were, delivered in that perfect suburban tone that let you deny malice, if confronted. But the message was clear.
Not welcome. Not really.
Not when you're loud. Not when you stand out. Not when you refuse to play the smiling, harmless role they want. Shaq swallowed hard, forcing himself to turn away, to walk back inside. He couldn't afford a confrontation. Not now. Not like this. Not with Landon sleeping just inside, his little world already rattled. But as he shut the patio door behind him, the weight of those whispered words settled heavily on his shoulders, pressing down, making every breath feel just a little harder to take. He sat heavily in the armchair across from the couch, elbows on his knees, staring down at the floor. His mind churned. He thought about Lucille's voice on the phone earlier, her warnings that had sounded so cautious, so careful. He thought about Reggie's quiet, resigned expression, as the police had handled him like a threat. He thought about how many times he'd told himself that his success, his name, his status, would protect his family from this kind of ugliness. And now, sitting here in his beautiful home on his perfect street, Shaq realized just how naive that had been. His eyes lifted to Landon, the boy stirring slightly in his sleep, brow creasing as if troubled even in his dreams. Shaq's heart twisted. He had to figure this out. He had to help his grandson understand this world, not just shield him from it, but truly prepare him for it. Because pretending it didn't exist wasn't working anymore. Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly, closing his eyes. Tomorrow he would call Reggie, make sure the man was okay. Tomorrow he would talk to Lucille again. Maybe bring her over to help explain things to Landon, in a way an 8-year-old could understand. Tomorrow he would figure out how to stand up to the whispers without letting them pull him down. But tonight he would sit here, watching over his grandson, letting the anger simmer quietly inside, promising himself that no matter how hard it got, he wasn't going to let the weight of other people's judgment shape the boy's sense of self. He wasn't going to let the ugly whispers define them. He was Big Shaq, not because of the courts, not because of the fame, but because he had survived, endured, and risen above. And now it was his turn to help Landon understand what that truly meant. Lucille O'Neill arrived just after dusk, a soft knock on the door so familiar it pulled Shaq from his seat. Before the sound fully registered, he opened the door to find his mother standing there, wrapped in a dark shawl, her sharp eyes scanning his face before pulling him into a brief but fierce hug. She smelled faintly of lavender and starch, the way she always had. When she stepped inside, her gaze swept over the quiet house, landing gently on the couch, where Landon lay curled under a blanket, still asleep. "Poor baby," Lucille murmured softly, setting her purse down and smoothing her hands over her sleeves. "He saw too much today, didn't he?" Shaq nodded silently, his throat tightening as he led her into the kitchen. The two of them sat across from each other at the heavy oak table, the same table Shaq had once crowded around as a boy. Legs too long, dreams too big, hungry for both food and a way out. Lucille folded her hands carefully on the table's edge, waiting for Shaq to settle, for the weight in his shoulders to drop just enough for the words she needed to deliver to find their mark. Shaq tried to speak first. "Mama, I swear. I thought—" Lucille raised a hand gently, not to silence him but to still the panic she could hear bubbling, just beneath his words. "Baby, you don't have to explain anything to me. I know what happened today without you saying a word. I know it, because I've lived it. And you've lived it. And now that little boy over there's lived it too." Her voice stayed calm, but it was laced with something sharp, something deliberate. Shaq dropped his gaze to his large hands, palms pressed flat on the table, the tension coiled so tight in his chest it felt like it might snap. "I thought I was past this, Mama. I thought I built something strong enough that Landon wouldn't have to see it like we did." Lucille gave a soft, sad smile, her fingers curling slightly, as she leaned forward. "You built a beautiful life, baby. Don't ever doubt that. But there are some things we don't get to outgrow. Some things we can't buy our way past. You know what they see when they look at you, no matter how many trophies you got, no matter how many commercials you're in. And you know what they saw today when they looked at that man on the curb, kneeling beside your grandson." Shaq's fists clenched, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. His mind filled with the memory of Reggie's face, calm and patient, then the way the police had grabbed him without hesitation, without thought, and worst of all, Landon's wide, innocent eyes watching it unfold, his little voice trembling with confusion. "I thought I could shield him," Shaq murmured, his voice cracking low. "I thought if I just kept him surrounded by love, kept him here, in this nice house on this nice street." Lucille's voice cut gently but firmly through his spiraling thoughts. "That's where you're wrong, Shaquille. You can't shield him from the world by pretending it's not there. You can't wrap him up in love and hope it'll be enough to keep the ugliness out. Because one day, no matter how careful you are, the world will come knocking. And if you haven't prepared him, if you haven't told him the truth, it'll shatter him. Shaq's shoulders slumped forward, his massive frame folding in on itself like a mountain crumbling under its own weight. His mind flashed back to himself as a boy, walking beside Lucille in a crowded grocery store, hearing the murmurs and the not-so-quiet comments, feeling his mother's hand tighten on his shoulder when someone cut in line or made a pointed remark about certain kinds of people. He remembered the sting in her eyes, the way she held her head high but her jaw would clench so tight it looked painful. He remembered vowing, even then, that one day he'd lift them both out of all that money and fame and success would build walls high enough to keep it all away. And yet here he was, decades later, watching it seep through the cracks of his perfect life, sliding under doors and around corners, finding its way to his grandson. Lucille reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over Shaq's clenched fist. You think this is just about today? About the police? Or the neighbors? Or that poor garbage man? Baby, this is about you. It's about the pieces of you you've tried so hard to ignore. The hurt, the anger, the parts of yourself you locked away so you could walk through this world and make people love you. But they didn't disappear, and now they're right here, sitting at your table, asking you to face them. Shaq's throat worked, his eyes shining faintly, as he fought back the sudden rush of emotion. His mother's hand was warm, steady, grounding him. I don't know how to explain it to him, Mama. Shaq whispered. How do I tell Landon that the world's not fair? That it'll judge him before it knows him? Just like it judged me. Just like it judged Reggie. Lucille's smile was small but fierce. You tell him the truth, Shaquille. You tell him the world will see his skin before it sees his heart. But you make sure he knows his heart is worth more than anything they can throw at him. You remind him where he comes from, and you remind him who he is, and you let him see you, not just the big Shaq on TV, not just the smiling face in interviews, but the man who's been through the fire and came out stronger. Shaq let out a long, shaking breath, bowing his head as his mother squeezed his hand once more. From the living room, a soft rustling sound drew their attention. Landon stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily, his small voice cutting through the heavy air. Grandpa? Shaq rose slowly, his towering figure moving toward the boy, every step heavy with both exhaustion and purpose. He scooped Landon gently into his arms, holding him close, feeling the boy's tiny arms wrap around his neck. Lucille watched from the kitchen, her heart full, her eyes sharp. Shaq kissed the top of Landon's head, whispering softly, I'm here, little man. I've got you. Always. But as he rocked his grandson gently, his eyes lifted over Landon's head, locking briefly with Lucille's. He understood now. It wasn't just about shielding Landon from the world. It was about preparing him for it. The house had fallen into a soft hush, the kind of silence that settles in the hours after a storm. Landon was upstairs now, tucked into bed, his small face pressed into the pillow, eyes closed but his brow still creased with faint worry. Even in sleep, Shaq stood in the hallway outside the boys' room, his large frame filling the space, one hand braced against the doorframe, listening to the slow rhythm of Landon's breathing. The boy had gone to sleep quietly, but Shaq could feel it, the weight still pressing on his grandson's tiny shoulders, the questions still hanging in the air, unspoken but pulsing. He walked softly down the hall toward Landon's room, intending only to tidy up, maybe pick up the scattered toys or straighten the books on the shelf. But as he moved around the room, his eye caught on something unusual, a small spiral-bound notebook, tucked between the bed frame and the wall. It was a little worn, the edges slightly bent, the cover decorated with colorful stickers that had started peeling. Curious, Shaq eased it free, thumbing it open gently. What he saw inside stopped him cold. Page after page, filled with Landon's careful, innocent drawings, bright crayons, bold strokes, the raw honesty only a child's hand could deliver. The first pages were harmless enough, pictures of Shaq and Landon, at the basketball court, a big smiling sun overhead, stick figures with giant heads, and broad grins. But as he flipped further, the images darkened. There was Reggie, unmistakable with his scarred face, kneeling beside Landon on the curb. Next to him, drawn larger and sharper, were the police officers, their badges marked, their hands reaching, their faces drawn in angry, exaggerated frowns. Shaq's stomach tightened as he turned the next page. There, crudely but unmistakably, was a picture of himself, not smiling, Not strong, but in chains. Huge, heavy shackles wrapped around his wrists, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn with wide, fearful eyes. Shaq's breath caught in his throat, his chest constricting painfully. He sat down heavily on the edge of Landon's bed, notebook trembling slightly in his massive hands. He thought back to the afternoon, to the moment the police swarmed, to the way Landon had clung to him, eyes darting between his grandfather and the officers, his small body rigid with fear. He thought of the way Landon had been so quiet afterward, retreating into himself, his little mind working overtime to process a world far more complicated, far more cruel than any child should have to face. Shaq ran a hand over his face, pressing the heels of his palms into his eyes, willing himself not to break down. He had worked his whole life to shield Landon from this, to give him a safe, happy childhood, free from the fear and pain Shaq himself had known all too well. But the world had found its way in anyway, slipping past the gates and the security cameras, wrapping its cold fingers around his grandson's innocent heart. Shaq flipped through the notebook slowly, his eyes burning as he took in each drawing. One page showed Landon himself, standing alone, surrounded by towering adult figures who loomed ominously over him. Another showed Shaq, his figure half light, half shadow, as if Landon wasn't sure whether to draw him as the superhero or the prisoner. The emotional blow hit hard, cutting deeper than any headline, deeper than any fan's criticism or public scandal. This was his grandson, his little man, struggling to make sense of a world that was showing its harshest face, far too soon. Shaq rose quietly, carrying the notebook downstairs. He paced the living room, the weight of the images pressing down on him, his mind churning with guilt, anger, and helplessness. He thought of Lucille's words earlier, the hard truth she'd delivered at the kitchen table. You have to face the wounds you never wanted to admit you still carry. He realized now he'd been trying so hard to protect Landon from the world's ugliness that he'd underestimated just how sharp a child's eyes could be, how deeply they absorbed what adults tried to smooth over. Landon hadn't just seen the police rough up Reggie. He'd seen the fear ripple through his own grandfather, the vulnerability in a man he'd always believed was untouchable. The realization tore at Shaq's heart. He sat down on the edge of the couch, staring down at the notebook, turning it over in his hands. The suspense in his chest built like a rising tide. How could he help Landon process this? How could he explain a world that still sometimes left him? Shaquille O'Neal, feeling powerless and enraged. How do you guide a child through the maze of injustice when you're still figuring out how to navigate it yourself? The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, the neighborhood had settled back into its quiet rhythms, the earlier drama fading into the polished calm of nighttime Willow Creek. But inside the house, Shaq felt a storm gathering, one that couldn't be ignored, one that wouldn't simply blow over with time. He thought about the conversations he'd avoided, the delicate, painful talks about race, about justice, about history and struggle, and survival. He thought about all the moments he'd chosen to focus on joy, on light, on love, because he wanted Landon's world to be filled with those things. But love, he realized, wasn't just about sheltering someone from pain. Sometimes love meant walking beside them through the hardest truths, showing them how to face what hurts, and still stand tall. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the notebook balanced carefully in his giant hands. He made a silent promise to himself, and to Landon. No more pretending. No more hoping the world would play fair, if they just smiled enough, worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough. He would find the words. He would face the questions. He would meet Landon's wide, searching eyes with honesty, even when it hurt. And he would make sure his grandson understood, truly understood, that his identity, his worth, his power came not from avoiding the world's shadows, but from standing strong within them. Shaq closed the notebook slowly, exhaling as he looked toward the staircase where Landon slept. Tomorrow they would begin. Morning light spilled across the kitchen counters, catching the edge of Shaq's coffee mug as he sat, unmoving, at the table. His phone vibrated for the third time in under a minute. He didn't bother to glance at it. He already knew who it was. His agent Carter had been calling since dawn, his texts piling up overnight. Shaq had been too wired to sleep, too haunted by Landon's drawings, by the memory of Reggie being shoved up against a squad car, by the tight-lipped stares from his own neighbors. With a heavy sigh, he finally reached for the phone and swiped it open. "Shaq, man, we gotta talk." Carter's voice came through the speaker, sharp, controlled, the tone of someone used to managing crises. This thing's all over social. Videos circulating, hashtags popping up, reporters are sniffing. We need a statement. Calm, measured, no controversy. Just smooth it over, big guy. Shaq leaned back in his chair, the weight of his massive body sinking deep into the seat. His eyes drifted to the window where Landon sat outside on the back patio, sketchbook in hand, small shoulders hunched in concentration. He'd barely spoken that morning. He'd smiled faintly when Shaq kissed his forehead, but the boy's eyes carried the heaviness of a truth too big for his ears. "Shaq, you there?" Carter's voice snapped him back. "I'm here," Shaq rumbled, his voice low, edged with fatigue. "Look, I know you're upset. I get it. But listen to me. This isn't the time to stir the pot. We can issue a nice clean statement. Something like, we respect law enforcement. We appreciate the community. Misunderstandings happen. Keep it friendly. Keep it light. That way you stay above the noise." Shaq closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening. He could almost hear the script Carter wanted him to follow. The polished PR lines, the gentle reassurance, the message that said everything and nothing all at once. But his heart pulled hard in another direction. "Have you seen what they're saying about Reggie?" Shaq asked quietly. There was a pause. "Yeah, I've seen the headlines. But Shaq, he's not your responsibility. You barely know the guy. He's not part of your circle. You jumping into this, it's risky. You've worked hard to build a brand. People trust. You don't want—" Shaq cut him off, his voice firm, steady. "Carter, I watched them throw him against a car for no reason, in front of my grandson. And now they're dragging his name through the dirt. You really think I can just sit here and smile for the cameras?" Carter exhaled hard. "I'm telling you, man, the media cycle moves fast. You stay out of it. It fades. You jump in. You make a statement about injustice, about racism. Now you're a headline. Now you're a controversy. Sponsors start calling. Networks get nervous. You want to go down that road." Shaq stood abruptly, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the room. He moved to the window, watching Landon carefully shade a figure on his page, the tip of his tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth. Eyes narrowed in deep focus. Shaq knew those drawings weren't just play anymore. They were how the boy processed his fears, his confusion, his questions about a world that had shown its teeth too soon. The conflict inside Shaq sharpened, a raw, twisting pressure. His public life, his endorsements, his TV appearances, his carefully crafted image, had always been about connection, laughter, joy. He was the big guy everyone loved. The gentle giant, the smiling star. But right now, none of that armor could cover what was happening inside his chest. Because when it came down to it, Shaq wasn't just a brand. He was a grandfather. He was a son. He was a black man who knew exactly what Reggie's silent, resigned expression had meant on that sidewalk. He thought back to the conversation with Lucille, to the hard truth she'd delivered, without flinching. You can't shield Landon from this. You can't pretend you're immune. Carter's voice broke through again. Shaq, listen. You've always been about positivity, man. You bring people together. Don't mess with that now. You want me to draft something for you. Something neutral. Something safe. Shaq turned away from the window, his broad shoulders squared, his eyes sharp with resolve. No, Carter. No safe statements. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I didn't see what I saw. You draft me something honest, or I'll write it myself. There was a long silence on the line. Finally, Carter muttered, "All right, man. Your call. But don't say I didn't warn you." Shaq ended the call, dropping the phone onto the table. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision he'd just made. He knew the risks. He knew the backlash could come, but he also knew there were some moments when you had to stand up, not because it was easy, but because it was right. The house creaked softly as he walked to the back patio, easing the door open. Landon looked up, his small face lighting up faintly at the sight of his grandfather. Shaq smiled gently, sinking down beside the boy, resting his heavy arm across the back of the bench.
"What are you working on, little man?"
Shaq asked softly. Landon turned the notebook around, revealing a new drawing. This one of Shaq himself standing tall beside Reggie, their arms linked, with Landon drawn small but proud between them. The police and the neighbors stood further back, their faces less angry, more curious, more uncertain. Shaq's heart swelled painfully, a mix of pride and sorrow so deep it almost stole his breath. He reached out, ruffling Landon's hair. "You got a good heart, kid," Shaq murmured, his voice thick, We're gonna make sure people see it. We're gonna make sure they hear you. And we're not gonna stay quiet when they try to tell the wrong story. He didn't know exactly what the next steps would look like. He didn't know what doors his honesty might close, what tensions it might stir. But he knew this. He was done choosing comfort over truth. For Reggie. For Lucille. For Landon. For himself. The police station conference room smelled faintly of stale coffee and lemon-scented floor cleaner. Shaq sat at the long table, his massive hands folded carefully in front of him, his posture steady but coiled with restrained tension. Across from him sat Police Chief Darryl Crane, a lean, gray-haired man in his late 50s, with deep lines etched into his face and the cold, polished gaze of someone who'd been navigating political waters for decades. The chief gave Shaq a measured smile, his tone carefully neutral. "Shaquille, thanks for coming in. I want you to know we take concerns like yours very seriously." Shaq inclined his head slightly, his voice low but firm. "I appreciate you making time, Chief, but I didn't come here for courtesy. I came here because what happened the other day wasn't right, and we both know it." Crane's jaw tightened for the briefest moment, before smoothing back into a polite, unreadable expression. "I reviewed the reports myself. Officers responded to a 911 call about a possible child endangerment. They followed protocol. Nobody was harmed." Shaq's eyes sharpened. "Nobody was harmed." Chief, my grandson watched your officers slam an innocent man against a car while neighbors stood by, whispering lies. Landon hasn't slept right since. He's drawing pictures of me in chains. Tell me, does that count as no harm in your book?" The chief's lips thinned. He leaned forward slightly, hands steepled. "I understand emotions are high, but we can't let media noise or public pressure dictate our operations. My officers responded to a call. They arrived, assessed the situation, and resolved it. If you're asking me to apologize for doing their job." "I'm not asking for an apology, Chief," Shaq cut in smoothly, his deep voice steady, unwavering. "I'm asking for honesty. For you to admit there's a problem when a man can't kneel beside a child on a sunny sidewalk without getting profiled, cuffed and smeared in headlines." For a beat, the room held a sharp silence, the air crackling with unsaid truths. Crane gave a small shake of his head, his voice still cool. "We have policies, Shaquille. We train our people thoroughly. But this is a tough city. We can't afford to hesitate when a child's safety might be at risk." Shaq let out a quiet, humorless laugh, leaning forward on his elbows. "Let me ask you something, Chief. If that man kneeling next to my grandson had been white, would your officers have come in sirens blazing? Would they have drawn suspicion, or just assumed it was a kind neighbor, a worker doing his job?" Crane's gaze flickered, just slightly. "I can't speak in hypotheticals." Shaq's massive frame seemed to expand slightly, as he sat back, his presence filling the room with unspoken challenge. "Then let me make it real. I'm not sitting here today as Big Shaq, as the celebrity who shakes hands at fundraisers or waves at parades. I'm here as a grandfather, as a black man raising a black boy who's just learned, way too soon, that his skin can make him a target, even in the safest place we know." The chief shifted in his seat, his polite mask slipping just a touch. "With all due respect, Shaquille, you live in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the state. You have resources most people can only dream of. You and your family aren't exactly lacking for protection." Shaq's eyes darkened, his voice dropping low. "You think money erases this? You think celebrity status puts me in some magical category, where my family doesn't feel the weight of suspicion, of judgment, of fear? Look at me, Chief. Really look. I'm not here asking for special treatment. I'm asking why your officer's first instinct was force, not questions. Why the men sworn to protect my family made my grandson afraid of them." The chief inhaled sharply, folding his hands tighter. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the only sound in the room. Finally, Crane cleared his throat, his voice carefully controlled. "We're reviewing the call. We're reviewing the footage. But I can't make promises about wholesale change based on a single incident." Shaq rose slowly to his feet, his towering presence casting a long shadow across the room. "I didn't come here for promises, Chief. I came to tell you I'm watching. My family's watching. And a lot of people out there are watching too. You want to lead this city? You want to claim you stand for fairness and justice? Then prove it. Not with words, with action." Crane's expression hardened slightly, but there was a flicker of something else, Maybe recognition, maybe the first seed of discomfort, buried deep in his eyes. I'll take that under advisement, Shaquille. Shaq gave a faint nod, his face calm but his eyes burning with quiet intensity. I'm sure you will. As he turned and walked out, the weight on his shoulders didn't lift. If anything, it pressed heavier. He knew change wouldn't come overnight. He knew this system wasn't built to bend easily, not even for someone like him. But as he stepped out into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on his skin, he thought of Landon's small, determined face, of Lucille's unflinching wisdom, of Reggie's quiet strength. He thought of every moment that had led him here, not as a star, not as a brand, but as a man standing at the edge of a long, hard road. Shaq took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked forward, knowing one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the neighborhood, making the sidewalks glow as if they held secrets. Shaq had been in his home office, poring over emails, his mind half locked on the public statement Carter had finally drafted, half wandering to the meeting with Chief Crane that still gnawed at his chest. But something pulled his attention, a strange quiet, a prickling instinct. He rose, peered out the window, and his heart lurched. Landon was gone. Shaq's massive strides took him through the house, past Lucille, who sat reading calmly, not yet aware. The front door stood slightly ajar, its gentle swing betraying the small figure that had slipped out. Shaq hurried down the porch steps, his chest tight, his eyes scanned the street, heart hammering, until he spotted the small silhouette walking confidently toward the garbage truck parked 2 houses down. Landon's little feet padded across the sidewalk, his small hands clutching a folded paper close to his chest. Shaq slowed, watching, caught between panic and awe, as his grandson, without a word to anyone, approached Reggie. Reggie had just finished tossing a heavy bag into the back of the truck, wiping sweat from his brow with a stained cloth. His face, usually hardened by routine and years of wary glances, softened in surprise when Landon appeared at his side. The boy held the paper up shyly, his eyes wide but determined. Shaq stayed back, hidden partially by a tree, his breath caught in his throat. Reggie crouched slowly, taking the paper in his thick, calloused hands, unfolding it with careful fingers. Shaq squinted to see. It was one of Landon's drawings. 2 figures, drawn boldly in crayon, one tall, one small, both standing together with proud smiles, surrounded by simple sun rays and bright blue sky. Beneath the picture, Landon had written in his uneven, childish scrawl, "You're my friend." Shaq's throat tightened as he watched Reggie's face change. The man stared at the picture for a long moment, his scarred cheek twitching slightly. Then his chest rose in a shaky breath, and to Shaq's astonishment, Reggie's eyes shimmered, his lashes dampening as silent tears filled his gaze. His large hand gently ruffled Landon's curls, his rough voice barely audible from where Shaq stood. "Thank you, little man." Shaq exhaled slowly, his body easing just a fraction. He stepped forward cautiously, not wanting to shatter the fragile moment. Reggie looked up as Shaq approached, blinking quickly, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. "Hey, Mr. O'Neill," he murmured, his voice thick. "Your grandson, he's got a good heart." Shaq managed a small, wry smile, crouching beside Landon, who beamed up at him proudly. "Yeah," Shaq rumbled softly, resting a massive hand on Landon's small shoulder. "Yeah, he does." The 3 of them lingered there, a quiet trio under the glowing sun, surrounded by the gentle rustle of trees and the distant hum of neighborhood life. But then the faint click of a camera. Shaq's head whipped up just in time to see a sleek black car parked across the street, a long lens protruding from the open window. His stomach sank. Another click, another flash, and then, as if summoned by the scent of drama, a van rolled around the corner, marked with a local news logo. A reporter hopped out, already straightening her blazer, camera crew in tow. Shaq's body tensed. He rose slowly, shielding Landon slightly with his arm, his voice low but urgent. "All right, buddy, let's head back inside." But Landon clung to his drawing, looking up at Shaq with innocent confusion. "Grandpa, why are they taking pictures?" Shaq knelt to eye level, brushing Landon's curls gently. "Because sometimes people want to tell their own stories, little man, even when they don't know the real one." Reggie stood awkwardly, shifting his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "I don't want to cause no trouble," he muttered, glancing toward the crew now approaching with eager smiles and poised microphones. Shaq shook his head firmly. You didn't cause anything, Reggie. The reporter called out cheerfully. Shaquille, can we get a comment? We hear you're planning to speak out about local policing. Care to share a preview? Shaq's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. He rose to his full height, the imposing figure the public knew, but inside, his mind churned with something deeper, heavier. He'd come out here not as a celebrity, not as a brand, but as a grandfather witnessing a small, powerful moment between two people the world wanted to push to opposite corners. And now that quiet moment was being circled, primed for headlines, packaged for public consumption. Landon tugged his sleeve gently. Grandpa, are they mad at Mr. Reggie again? Shaq crouched beside him, wrapping an arm around the boy, voice low. No, buddy. But they're looking for something to talk about. And we're not gonna let them turn this into something ugly. Straightening, Shaq turned to Reggie, offering a steady, grounding nod. You okay, man? Reggie gave a small, grateful smile.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Shaq took Landon's hand, guiding him gently toward the house, as the reporter continued calling after them. Undeterred, Shaq took Will you be holding a press conference? What message do you want to send today? Shaq paused briefly at the steps, turning his head just enough to meet her gaze across the street. His voice was calm, rich with quiet authority. The message, he said, is that sometimes the most powerful moments don't need a microphone. They just need to be seen. Then he stepped inside, closing the door gently behind them. The camera still flashing outside, hungry for a headline that would never capture the heart of what had just passed between a boy, a man, and the quiet, defiant power of simple human connection. It started with a sudden, sharp wail of sirens cutting through the peaceful suburban afternoon, the kind of sound that instantly tightens every chest and pulls every eye toward the street. Shaq was standing by the front window, sipping his coffee, Landon on the couch quietly coloring, when the noise jolted him upright. For a breathless moment, his heart clenched. Had something happened to Reggie again? Was this another attack of suspicion? Another careless storm of flashing lights aimed at the wrong target? He opened the front door cautiously, stepping onto the porch, his gaze scanning the street. Reggie, halfway down the block by his truck, turned too, his shoulders tensing visibly. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, the same ones who'd clustered days earlier to whisper about the danger that didn't exist. But this time, the sirens didn't slow near Reggie. They didn't veer toward Shaq's home. Instead, they pulled hard to the curb across the street, lights flashing violently as two squad cars boxed in, a sleek, silver SUV parked in front of the Delaney residence. Shaq felt Landon slip beside him, clutching his leg tightly, wide-eyed as they both watched the scene unfold. From the Delaney house, Mr. Delaney himself emerged, always immaculately dressed, always the polite, sharp-voiced neighbor, who had been one of the loudest murmurers during last week's incident. He walked stiffly down the front steps, head held high, his face pale but determined. Police officers flanked him, one reading him his rights calmly, the other slipping handcuffs over his wrists. Shaq's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of cold realization dawning in his chest. Across the street, Mrs. Delaney clutched the doorway, her mouth parted in a silent gasp, her carefully styled hair trembling faintly as neighbors began to trickle out, drawn by the commotion. What's happening, Grandpa? Landon whispered, tugging gently at Shaq's shirt. Shaq crouched, keeping his deep voice calm. Looks like they're arresting Mr. Delaney, buddy. But why? Landon's small brow furrowed. Shaq lifted his eyes back to the unfolding scene, his mind already piecing together the unspoken story. Tax fraud, money laundering, white-collar crimes buried under decades of polished smiles and golf club memberships. Whispers floated across the street, stunned gasps, phrases like, "I can't believe it," and "he always seemed so respectable." The same people who had thrown judgment like daggers at Reggie without knowing his name. Reggie had edged closer now, standing beside Shaq at the sidewalk, his face unreadable. "Well," Reggie murmured softly, "would you look at that?" Shaq gave a faint, knowing smile, his voice steady. "Yeah, look at that." The irony hung heavy in the air, bitter and sharp. The same community that had rushed to criminalize a black garbage collector, the same neighbors who'd called the cops over a child sitting on a curb, had been living beside a man quietly breaking the law for years. But no one had watched Mr. Delaney with suspicion. No one had called the police on him for walking down the block. No one had thought twice about trusting him, because he fit the picture they wanted to see. Shaq felt a strange, fierce wave rise inside. Not quite anger, not quite satisfaction, but a deeper awareness, a hard-earned clarity. Injustice wasn't just about who got blamed. It was about who got overlooked, whose sins were politely ignored while others were hunted for shadows. Landon tugged again, his small voice puzzled. Grandpa, Mr. Delaney's in handcuffs. Is he going to jail? Shaq scooped the boy into his arms, pressing a gentle kiss to his curly head. I don't know, little man. That's up to the police to figure out. He paused, his voice softening. But remember what we talked about. How sometimes people can look safe on the outside and still make bad choices. And how sometimes people who look rough or different can actually have the biggest hearts. Landon nodded slowly, his eyes still wide, absorbing every word. Together they watched as the officers guided Mr. Delaney into the squad car, the weight of the moment rippling across the street. Neighbors murmured, exchanging worried glances, their confidence cracked, their assumptions shaken. Reggie gave a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Ain't that something, Shaq? Whole time they were watching me like I was the problem. Shaq reached out, clapping a broad hand on Reggie's shoulder. Yeah, man, it's always the ones nobody's watching. His voice held no gloat, no triumph, just a grounded, weary wisdom. For a moment, the three of them stood there, a giant of a man, his small grandson perched in his arms, and the scarred garbage collector who had been judged so wrongly just days ago. Together they faced a street forever changed, a neighborhood forced to confront truths it had long chosen to ignore. Shaq's chest swelled with a mix of resolve and hope. He knew this wasn't the end. The fight for fairness, for justice, for dignity. It never really ended, but moments like this mattered. Small shifts, tiny cracks in the facade, glimpses of truth pushing through. He squeezed Landon gently, whispering into his ear, "We keep showing up, little man. We keep standing tall. That's how we make it better." Landon wrapped his small arms around Shaq's neck, burying his face there, his voice muffled but content. Okay, Grandpa. Shaq exchanged one last glance with Reggie, a quiet nod passing between them, an unspoken promise that they saw each other now, truly saw each other, and that they weren't alone in this. As they turned back toward the house, the news crews began to gather again, their cameras swinging toward the new scandal, the fresh headline. Shaq smiled faintly to himself, shaking his head. Let them chase their stories. He had his own story to write, one of love, resilience, and the slow, powerful change that comes not from flashing lights or breaking news, but from people standing together, refusing to let the world tell them who they are. With Landon safe in his arms, Shaq walked inside, knowing the fight wasn't over. But neither was hope. Would you like me to compile the full 10,000-word script next? Every neighborhood holds stories no one wants to tell. Every family carries truths the world tries to silence. It's not just about watching injustice, it's about standing in it, facing it, and refusing to back down. Let this story remind you. Real change begins when we stop looking away and start looking deeper. Are you ready to open your eyes to what's been waiting in plain sight?